My name is Tama Simone Bryant, and I am a descendant of the Mende people who survived the transatlantic slave trade. I want to acknowledge my ancestors whose exploited labor is the basis of this nation's accelerated growth, and whose genius and creativity have left an imprint in every industry and every field. I also want us to acknowledge the indigenous people who cultivated this land that we call Nashville. People like the Cherokee, the Seneca, the Shawnee, those who were forcibly removed but who continue to live today, cultivating land and legacy beyond our years. So here at the intersection of land and labor, spoken and unspoken truths, we gather. My first name, Tama, means queen. My parents, having lived through anti-Black racism, lovingly armed me with this name, recognizing that even people who underestimate me have to honor me when they say my name. My middle name, Simone, is after the legendary singer, songwriter, activist, and truth teller Nina Simone. And my last name, Bryant, connects me with a legacy of preachers, orators, storytellers, and griots who understand the power of the word. Understanding the power of words, I'm a psychologist who is here to talk to you today about decolonizing psychology. To colonize is to capture, to take, to control, to disconnect, to disenfranchise, to de-identify. To decolonize is to reclaim, to reconnect, to honor, to recognize our interconnectedness with all living things. It is to identify with truth and live from a place of truth. A colonized psychology sees you fundamentally as a series of cognitions for us to diagnose, pathologize, control, transform, change, detect, research. A decolonized psychology recognizes that your social, political, economic environment and systems affects your mental health. So why is decolonizing psychology so important here in the States? The American Psychological Association has documented that people of color are underrepresented in the field. In fact, they have found that 4% of psychologists are Black, 4 to 5% are Asian, 5 to 10% are Latino, and 0.3% are Native American. 1% indicate that they are mixed race or other. Even though we are underrepresented in the field of psychology, we are at increased risk for stress and trauma. In fact, the FBI found last year that hate crimes were at their highest for the past 12 years. And in major cities, hate crimes were up 39 to 44% last year. And so with the realities of racial stress and trauma, as well as other sources of stress and trauma, we need a contextualized psychology. When we take a global perspective, I'm reminded of a story that is told in Rwanda. In the aftermath of national trauma and terror, the people were brokenhearted and need healing. An elder reports that Westerners came who were mental health professionals and claimed they were going to help us heal. The elder reports they said they were going to help us feel better. They came with no songs. They came without dancers. They didn't bring any storytellers. They separated us from each other. They took us out of the sun and put us into dark rooms and told us to tell them our most painful memories. It was not healing. We had to ask them to leave. Indigenous healers around the globe often assess psychology and often assess distress with a variation of these questions. When did you lose connection with your Creator? When did you stop honoring your ancestors? When did you stop singing? When did you stop dancing? When did you stop finding yourself in the gift of story? If you answer those questions, I'll have a sense of the timeline and the source of your distress. So we need to decolonize psychology. We need to shift from an over-focus and over-emphasis on the individual. while we are neglecting systems and start to pay attention to context. Can you imagine if a psychologist thought the only reason you have an eating disorder or body image issues is because of your cognitive distortions and the dieting practices of your mother? As if we are not all bombarded with messages from the time that we can perceive that tell us how we are supposed to look and that present these narrow ideas of beauty that are based on Eurocentric, ageist, ableist ideas that often leave your beauty and mine in the margins. A decolonized psychology says that we have to honor identity, culture, heritage, history, politics, because all of those things affect our lives and our mental health. So to decolonize psychology is also to recognize that justice is therapeutic. Justice is healing. Not just taking deep breaths, not just journaling, but if we can shift some social systems, it would help a lot of us feel a lot better. So as we are looking to decolonize, we want to decolonize the intake process. We want to decolonize our interventions to be more holistic, and we want to decolonize our outcomes so that we are not just helping people to cope, but actually empowering people to be agents of change. So to decolonize the intake process, I want to invite you to come into my office. There's a blue couch here, a blue chair there, a palm tree over there, some instruments in the corner. You get the picture. And so I want you to sit in on this intake process with a fictionalized African-American family, which we'll call the Murphys. Mr. Murphy works in corporate America and is very successful at his job. And at the end of the day, he comes home, watches TV with the door closed until late into the night. Mrs. Murphy also works during the day, comes home during the evening, is in the kitchen preparing dinner, and then in the living room by herself watching TV late until the night. The eldest child is a daughter who we'll call Charisma. Charisma is very studious, and she's in her room studying on her computer late until the night, getting all A's semester after semester. And then we have the little brother who we'll call Solomon, who claims he doesn't have any homework. So he's on his computer playing video games late into the night. So as a psychologist, I come in and we have to get the right questions so that I can formulate and have a case conceptualization, because my conceptualization of the case is going to lead to the treatment plan, and the treatment plan is going to lead to the outcomes. So the questions that I ask to frame your life help me to figure out what we are creating with our time together. So I asked Mrs. Murphy and asked the family, what is it that they've come in for? And Mrs. Murphy volunteers because she was the one who decided the family needed to come. And she said, my family is just too disconnected. Everybody's doing their own thing, and I want us to be together more as a family. A colonized psychology would hear what I just shared and say, well, we need to ask the parents about their family of origin and what were the communication styles with them. And we need to talk to them about the value of communication and quality time. We can give them a handout. You all know psychologists. We have a lot of handouts. We can give you a handout on connection. We can give you a handout about avoidance and the dangers of avoidance. We can give you a handout about too much screen time for little Solomon over there. We have lots and lots of handouts. And if I was really doing my job as a psychologist, I would give you homework, because we don't want to just sit here and talk and nothing ever changes. So this family needs to have an outing. How about bowling? And when you go bowling, leave all your devices in the car because you need to stay connected. And when you get advanced, you should start having dinner together maybe 4 to 5 times a week, because this will really be important to get the family connected. Does that sound good? It sounds pretty good, right? All of that is a colonized, cookie cutter, manualized approach to psychotherapy. And it went off the tracks because we did not ask the right questions. So if we start to go a little deeper and really begin to ask about people's experiences with discrimination, stereotype, and stigma, we'll get a different picture of this family. You'll find out that Mr. Murphy started having panic attacks when George Floyd was murdered. When George Floyd was murdered by a police officer and he was unarmed, Mr. Murphy started having nightmares where he also could not breathe. He started dreading going to work in the morning, and he would show up to corporate America being one of the few black men who worked in his agency. And even though he was very successful, he would find himself in the middle of the day, multiple times a day, having to run to the bathroom and put water on his face because he couldn't breathe. Mrs. Murphy, you would find out, is living with the realities of Superwoman syndrome, where we are often raised to erase ourselves, to neglect ourselves in service of everyone else. And while some call it Superwoman syndrome, a lot of people in the black community would say that's not a syndrome, that's ideal black womanhood. You are to surrender yourself for the saving of your family, erase and neglect yourself for the uplifting of our community. Some mental health professionals would call Mrs. Murphy too intense and too serious. They might even think to themselves that she's an angry black woman. The truth is, Mrs. Murphy is exhausted. I'm talking about soul tired, the kind of fatigue that won't be fixed by a nap or even a bowling trip. And then we have Charisma, who is very perceptive and insightful. She has picked up on the stress of her mother and the strain of her father and realized one of the things that brings her family joy are her A's and accomplishments. And so she gets lots of them and has immersed herself in perfectionism to not only relieve their pain and distress, but also to gain for herself some visibility. Going to a predominantly white school in a predominantly white neighborhood, her black beauty is often overlooked, denied, and ridiculed. She sees a lot of black girl magic in social media, but she's had trouble getting hold of that magic for herself. Last school year, she would spend hours in front of the mirror trying to make herself look like the queens on TV, but she would still walk through the halls, somehow invisible. After doing that for months, she gave up on that project and decided, you don't have to acknowledge I'm beautiful, but you will have to admit I'm smart. And that satisfied her on some level, but her soul is still hungry. And then we have Solomon. No one has given Solomon words for what it feels like as a black boy in America to constantly feel like he is under surveillance and suspicion. He doesn't have words for what it means this summer when he was walking through the mall from store to store trying to find a job and felt like people thought that he was a threat, a thug, violent, a monster, and no one would give him a chance. He does not have the words for it. He sees his father coping by drinking, and his mother copes with prayer, and his sister copes by studying, and none of those appeal to him. And so he goes into the alternative world of video games, where he can create his own character and decide how people respond to him. He can even accumulate power the longer he plays the game, and so he plays longer, but somehow the empowerment never translates to his real life. I hope as you hear this, family, you can see why a handout is insufficient on communication skills. I hope you can feel how a bowling activity is a very surface level response. But what is needed as we talk about transforming families and transforming communities is a decolonized approach that even incorporates their cultural traditions and arts. And so we start to sing a song I learned in Botswana. We are one family and none can separate us. None can separate us. None can separate us. We are one family and none can separate us. No, no, never. And then because we hold stress in our body and strain in our body, we even start to move and to dance in therapy, y'all. In therapy, we start to move and to dance. And do you know that when Mr. and Mrs. Murphy start dancing, their children fall out laughing because they've never seen their parents dance before? And in the midst of the poetry and the spoken word and the dance and the drama, I start to talk about the reason we need resistant strategies, not just coping strategies, but how do you protect your mind, your heart, your spirit when you are walking through toxic environments? And Charisma shares that she loves Beyonce's new song, that they can't break my soul. They can't break my soul. They can't break my soul. And as she tells that story, her mother starts to talk about when she was growing up, between learning how to cornrow hair and bake cornbread and cook collard greens, she also learned the importance of her walk. That her eldest aunt told her, all the women in this family are brilliant and foxes, so if you in this family, you got to know how to walk. And when you know how to walk, you are not invisible. And Mr. Murphy starts laughing because it was the walk that got his attention to begin with. And so in the midst of their sharing, Solomon breaks down and finally tells his family what happened this summer when he was trying to get a job and how he was treated and how he was followed around stores. And he starts to cry, and his sister hugs him, and his mother, because she is a superwoman, starts naming all of her friends who could give him a job, so he doesn't need to work at that raggedy mall anyway, because anybody who doesn't see the value of her son is garbage to begin with. And so they are intervening, and I look over to my right, and Mr. Murphy on the top is cool as a cucumber, but that right leg is shaking. And he's cool, and he's watching, and his son is crying. His sister is rubbing the son's back. His wife is strategizing, and the leg is shaking. And I said, can we all just take a breath in, reaching up to the sky? And can we all just shake everything out? And when we shake it all out, the leg stops shaking. And I say, Mr. Murphy, is there something you want to say to Solomon? And somewhere between a howl and a declaration and a whisper, he looks at his son and says, Solomon, you're a king. You're a king. And his son walks over and gives him a hug, and he whispers in his ear, you are a blessing everywhere you go. And as he talks to his son, he's talking to himself. As he talks to his son, he's talking to himself. And this is why it is not okay for psychologists to treat each of us like we are identical, because we are all living culturalized, politicized, real lives. And while we know transformation takes place in protest march and in the Supreme Court, that transformation happens based on who you put in the jury box and on the school board, I want you to know transformation also takes place in the therapy room. So in the words of Tracy Chapman, don't you know? We're talking about a revolution sound.